So, is Chris Gaiman here? No, Chris Gaiman?
No, he's in a workshop in Lyft.
So actually, how we're doing this is we are building off of Chris Gaiman's original arguments from an essay he wrote that has a title that escapes me right now. But in essence, it's about kind of having this discussion around whether or not art school is killing art. Now, I know that this room is stacked with arts professionals, whatever you want, however you want to define that, whichever way you want to go. So, how this is going to go is very quickly introduce the team, and then I will give you a brief paragraph. I'm going to read one paragraph of Chris's essay to get you all in the right frame of mind. You guys are yes? Team no, your team yes.
We're yes.
You see how this is going to go, right? So this is team yes, this is team no. Team yes, art school is killing art, is made up of Omar. Whoop, my bad. I still got this bad.
Cut her off, cut her off.
Wanda Manbush is an image and word warrior from Bossele First Nation. Currently, she's curator in residence at the Justina M. Barnaky Gallery and was the 2013 Dame Nita Barrow Distinguished Visitor of U of T Special. Adam Lambert is an undergraduate dropout. I like how you started there. That works, okay. Somehow managed to get an MFA graduate degree and postgraduate professional certificate in film archiving. Oh. He's special too. He makes moving images and performances when not working as curator of collections at Anthology Film Archives. He also despises Joseph Beuys, which is, woo! That just shuts this thing down right now. Which may or may not be irrelevant to this debate. Ross McLaren has been nipping at the heels of various institutes of higher education cumulatively for 72 years. Cumulatively, that's the word there. His failed academic career began at OCAD before it was designated as a university and continues at the rebranded Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, the Pratt Institute, and former University at Lincoln Center. He founded and was the first director of the Funnel Film Theater in Toronto, and his works have been screened around the world in all of those places that ScreenWorks. Into the gallery, digital installation, recently moved at the Butler Gallery in Lincoln Center, New York. That works? Okay. Y'all, Omar Estrada is a Cuban visual artist who works with interdisciplinary installation, sound, video, interactivity, and narrative text. His artwork explores the tension between art, science, and technology in the context of social structures. Okay. He was educated through the Cuban art school system and completed 16 years. Do you need to hear more of me? Okay.
We love you.
He was educated through the Cuban art school system and completed 16 years of specialized art education. Estrada has taught for more than 20 years in Cuba, Barbados, and Mexico. Kim Simon, maybe this really long bio. She's curator of TPW in Toronto. Yeah. Paige Simon.
Academic credential.
Paige Sarlin is an artist, filmmaker, scholar, and political activist. Her writings have been published in October. Rethinking Marxism, Views in Cultural Theory, the Journal of Aesthetics and Protest, and Framework of Journal of Film and Culture. She's at work on a book-length manuscript entitled Interview Work, The Genealogy of a Media Form. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Media Study at University of Buffalo, SUNY. That works for you?
That works for me.
Okay.
You need my credentials?
Okay, so just to kind of get back to Chris Gaiman's, unless you have questions about the people, which I assume you don't. Okay. So the essay that Chris Gaiman wrote a couple of years back is Rhetorical Maneuvers in Contemporary Art, Part 1. Is there a Part 2? Can we know?
I couldn't find it on
We'll
Word.
just say there's a Part 1. So just to go on at length about the evolution of art education, that kind of thing. But then what's interesting, I think, as a good starting point for here is this paragraph particularly. Chris writes, "For many years, my experience in editing critical texts was that artists were often better, clearer, more concrete, less pretentious writers than many academics and professional critics and curators. For one anthology, I labored for many hours to clarify meanings, correct errors, and generally improve a few essays by scholars with PhDs, while the contributions of practicing artists, even if they were sometimes tedious or obscure in some respects, were more direct and to the point and required little editing. What I notice about writing coming from artists who have emerged more recently from the educational system, however, is that it has begun to look more and more like writing produced by curators, critics, and academics. It is increasingly homogeneous. This should be no surprise, as more and more art schools become degree-granting institutions. Students spend more and more of their time in academic courses and courses that deal with the professional world in which they're expected to function in, i.e., that many, probably most students need to hold down jobs, i.e., courses on curating, critical writing, musicology, etc. At the same time, the cost of education has risen rapidly, so that many, probably most students need to hold down jobs during their years of post-secondary education as well. All of which must logically leave the student with less studio time, less time to devote to developing his or her own ideas and to the making of art, but well-schooled in the thought patterns and linguistic habits of curators, critics, and academics, hyper-aware, in fact, of the art historical context in which they work, and with a pretty good understanding of the art system. The art school graduate of 2010, which was when this was written, may leave school without having made anything of much consequence, but set up to write a pretty impressive sounding artist statement. We've moved as far as possible from the position expressed by Barnett Newman's famous quip that aesthetics is for the artist as ornithology is for the birds. So, with that handy little note, we're going to start this. I am really bad at coin flip, but we need to figure out who's going to start, which side is going to start. So is anybody good at a coin flip? Nobody in this room, no? Okay, you guys are calling it?
Heads, right?
Heads?
Obviously.
Naturally, heads.
I like tails, I know better.
Okay, this is the problem. This is it.
We all see heads.
We like tail, but we're going
What do you do?
I'll tell you after.
Oh, wow. Okay.
No, well, after the coin flip.
After the coin flip, okay, all right. After the coin flip, Ben's going to tell me something really important. So, sir, could you, please,
I flipped it, so.
what do you got?
Do we know what it means?
Heads.
No, we don't know what it means, but you just.
Okay, so we got
so
the
there it is,
choice.
okay. So you guys are going first because I said so. There. So, Ben, what did you want to say?
I think it's time we survey the crowd and see where people stand in the audience on this question.
About this question. Okay.
First question?
Wow. The question is art school killing art? That is the question we are asking, right, Ben?
Expect me to answer yes or no?
Yes.
Or no? That's what
Show of hands for yes. Oh my goodness.
We actually wrong.
Badass. Okay, show of hands for no. Okay, show of hands for all of you. Where's my beer? A larger group of people that are interested in beer. Those that are in favor of art school. Okay. I don't know what that says.
Show of offense for people who from the left hand and the right hand do not agree.
Alright, close together. So you guys are first.
Question, yes or no.
Okay, so how we're gonna do this, opening statement back and forth, rebuttal, and then closing statements, and then we throw it back out to you to, I guess, determine who won or whatever, made a better argument or however which way we wanna go. So without any further ado, Ross McLaren.
Thank you. Is this working?
Verify everything has 5 minutes, technically kind of sort of roundabout. Go ahead.
Okay. Is art school killing art? Question mark. Since being asked by the organizers to participate in this debate, is art school killing art? I've been asking friends, colleagues, students, what they felt about the issue. The results were 99% affirmative. Yes, art school is killing art. Or at least holding a pillow over its head. One tenured friend of mine responded, is medical school killing brain surgery? Should we think about that? As much a fan as I am of avant-garde treatments, I can see his point. On the other hand, the medical pharmaceutical industry has seen fit to chemically lobotomize most of the population. Whenever I face a new group of students, I assume that 50% of them are on some stimulant or sedative. Do you find that too? But art school is not medical school. It should be a greenhouse of experimentation. A curriculum based on the students' individual needs, a place to develop critical thinking tools and encourage autodidactic behavior. Just like that phrase. The last question I want to hear from a student is, how many films do I have to make to get an A? But who can blame them? They have been told that schools can create successful artists with their MFA programs, the Golden Fleece, the postgraduate degree. But in the race to professionalism, students often lose their unique voices and opt for promises of job or career. I find the most interesting student work often comes from the intro classes, awkward but full of potential. By the time they graduate, the formula has been imprinted. It looks like art, smells like art, and is ready for shipping to the next biennial. Economic pressures are also a factor, perhaps more in America than elsewhere. In the last 12 years, college tuition is up 900%, putting financial strain on graduates from which they may never recover. 2.5, okay, sorry. Consider the tragedy of Cooper Union. For 150 years, the school has offered free tuition scholarships and provided an example of the direction art schools should pursue. But now, because of financial mismanagement, expensive new architectural conceits, and a board of trustees immersed in the real estate porn that is Manhattan, students will have to start paying tuition, radically changing the composition of the student body and destroying the very character of the institution. School is big business, and it is responding to the dictates of the marketplace. It is not surprising the corporate business model used in nearly every aspect of our lives. We seem to have lost the dialogue or balance between the artist and the critic, theorist, curator. The proliferation of visual arts programs is pumping out art teachers and curators with the textbook ideas supporting textbook art. This environment produces a commodity that is safe for investors, curators as art market advisors. But all is not lost. Consider the work of Bruce High Quality Foundation, an arts collective in Brooklyn which was created to foster an alternative to everything. Some of the anonymous members of this group occasionally wandered through my film class at Cooper Union. The Bruces, with satirical, subversive, and humorous work that combines theory, criticism, and practice, shred the pretensions of the art world and academia. They also operate the unaccredited art school, the Bruce High Quality Foundation University. And so, the artist education is never finished. Need we accept the premise that art school legitimizes art, dictates who is qualified to produce artwork, and indeed are authorized forms of culture desirable.
Fine, sir. Thank you. All right, I want to encourage the other team to do what Ross did, which is to get under time.
I'll try.
No problem. Yeah, I'm just saying, you know. So who is actually going?
It's me.
Okay, so team,
No, it's not ruining art.
thank you for informing me.
Okay. No, it's not ruining.
You're on.
Thanks. So I just want to thank the organizers. I haven't had this much fun talking about art since graduate school. So, I think that that's just, part of what I, got out of graduate school. It also taught me how to debate about art school and have, I think it's important to know that first off, we're not going to follow the rules because in fact, art schools don't create sheep. All of us went to art school and so we just don't think it's important to follow rules. And so I just want to say that, okay? So, in fact, that's probably what art school taught us the most. But we just want to take the question as it is, a few of the assumptions. So, I think that, first off, we don't all necessarily agree that art is on the path to ruin or dying. And I think the Images Festival is a really good example that it's clearly not dying. So that's the first thing. It's like it clearly isn't working if art school's goal is to kill art. That's the first thing. Second thing, all art schools aren't the same. So I think that this isn't monolithic, right? There are a few different institutions and we can talk about what these different institutions are. But I don't think there's like a monolithic art school. I think maybe another way to ask this question would have been the MFA or even the practice PhD, which I teach in a department with a practice PhD. And then the last thing is that art schools, I don't think anyone believes who teaches in one or students, maybe they need to be disabused of this idea, but they, oh shoot. Ooh. See, I don't know how to follow rules, so I'm already at 3 minutes. But maybe I'm also, whatever, okay, but so, art schools aren't necessarily in the business of producing artists. Most art schools don't actually, most students who go to art schools don't end up as artists. So I think the assumption that, art schools equals the product of artists, I think is erroneous. I think that, I really am appreciative of the statement because you made a lot of the same arguments I want to make for why art school isn't killing art. It's the institutions, art schools are symptomatic of larger issues, so it's not art schools that are the problem, it's the general kind of capital situation, the neoliberal attacks on education, and I think that what we want to say is like, we're for education. Education isn't the problem. That we need more education. In fact, often in the framework of the United States, we have seen arts education like defunded terribly. So art schools are maybe sometimes the first place that kids encounter classes on art. I think that's, so that I think we can't blame art schools for everything that's wrong with the art world or one of the art worlds. And so the last, what's wrong with art schools may be wrong with everything else. And I agree with you what they should be, this amazing space of encounter. And so that's part of our project of being in them, not rejecting them outright. But the last provocation I want to ask everyone in this room is, imagine a world without art schools. What would that world look like? And in the framework of my university, that would mean that the sciences would get to determine what creativity was. They'd be teaching, we'd be relegated to nothing. And I think that the art schools are like the last stop, the last bastion of a kind of space for creative, critical thinking. But then I also want to ask you, what would images look like without art school? And what? Yeah. In terms of also images, but also the institutions, is that you would see white men teaching everywhere, you wouldn't see women. Because art schools were the path through which women gained access into the art world and art making and out of the home, out of the home. So I think that's important to think about. But then in terms of Images Festival specifically, you wouldn't see people being able to pick up 60mm cameras because they wouldn't be able to buy them on their own and the kinds of access to resources and experimental ideas, which they don't get from watching YouTube, though they might get from watching UbuWeb. So I just want to, so that's it. Okay.
All right.
We're all kind of taking a rebuttal.
Oh,
How long do we have?
we got 5 minutes.
Okay. Should we get some starting the rebuttal? I really want to thank our the No team for making some of our arguments for us. Especially around the idea that art schools.
I said that first. I said that first.
I know. So that's how generous we are to each other, right? But yes, especially in terms of thinking about how art schools don't produce artists. And I think that maybe that is part of where we're coming from in terms of thinking about whether the art coming out of art schools is actually coming from this kind of artistic impulse. When you talk about creativity, what is creativity? Creativity is kind of the production of, I think, kind of innovative, new, creative ideas, but where do those ideas come from? Do we want them to come from a disembodied head walking around thinking, or do we want them to come from the embodied person of where I think some of the most exciting art is coming out of, and maybe what we're talking about when we talk about institutionalization of art is also the disembodied head. And maybe that's part of the problem of what's happening with art. You talked about access for women, and access to ideas and access to equipment. I think there's a lot of artists who don't go to art school who still can access LIFT. They can get equipment at LIFT, they can go to BTAPE, they can go to Trinity Square, they can go to lots of other kind of communities of artists to actually create work. They don't necessarily have to go to art school for that. And most, I would say, Indigenous artists and artists of color didn't necessarily get there through art school. So there's another access issue with institutionalization that has to do with it being a very white culture.
Wow, that's really hard to follow up on. I need to have a sip of beer. Well, I found in my teaching experience in New York City at Purchase College that art school seems to be a place, or even film school, where people who have an interest in art or film go to because they don't think that they are suited to be lawyers or other professions, which is not to say that they are suited to be artists either. An appreciation of art and the aesthetics around it does not make one into an artist. And as a professor in the school faced with students whose commitment to their practice is not one driven by a desire to be an innovator, but to not be a doctor is a problem. And so the question there becomes, how do art programs select who will be coming there and who will be pushing the program further. And I think one of the things that we could also talk about here, of course, I mean, we mentioned commodity, but is the cost of access. The cost of access to the university in the U.S. is such that when you get out, to be an artist and to be codified and certified as an artist, it certainly means that you have to follow this romantic ideal of an artist who is in debt and who is poor. And I wonder why that is the case when really true creativity can be done with these tools right here, a piece of paper and a pen. My problem with art school in general, and in fact I had a great discussion during brunch earlier, is that art school has a tendency to rely upon words and words of explanation and words of contextualization to put one in a framework that marries your work to art as it exists. And so much of art as we see, and I think many people would agree, art that comes out of art school looks like art that is already in galleries, and or art that resembles art made by teachers or made by those who we are studying. So the question maybe is whether we should be looking at art as artists, or maybe we should be looking at sciences or other fields and finding influence from outside of ourselves, so that in visits to galleries and into exhibitions, one doesn't have to read the gallery press release or wall text to understand that this is art, and that the art itself is becoming so self-referential. My question doesn't become one about is art school killing art, but is art school killing audiences for art? That was totally intentional to cough, it was just to get me right there.
Okay.
So the idea a little bit is this. Is the responsibility of engineering school to produce good engineers? Of course, the idea of education is to produce knowledge and give tools and frameworks for understanding. The responsibility of what is going to happen with that is after school. The schools are places that should work as a shortcut to knowledge. You go there to learn certain things, but apart from that, to have a career as an engineer, as a scientist, as an artist, takes a life. It takes 4 years to educate yourself. You choose the part, you go there, get the tools, and then go out and do your job. I think one of the problems is exactly that artists have accepted that there should be institutions who mediate what we do and what is valid. When we talk about true creativity or valid art, what are we talking about? We are talking about all these preconceptions around the art world that legitimize certain practices, and we are talking then about curatorial work, we are talking about international spaces for exhibiting art, we are talking about curatorial work. Why is the function of the artist defined by that? Artists should be out there with their tools, and they should educate themselves as much as possible, because at the end of the day, education is a choice. What happens when we remove that choice? So why not to have that choice? And then people can do with that what they have to do. But also, when you go to School of Arts or any other kind of school, why is it expected that the guy or the person that the individual trained there is going to become a successful whatever in whatever space? No, you're going there for certain things, for knowledge, and then it's your responsibility to make that happen. The school is not the responsibility of the school. The school is a choice, and it should be there.
Yeah, I just want to remind our esteemed panel of yeses and our fabulous audience of the question is art school killing art? Not can you make good art without going to school? Not any other version of that story, not even, it also takes the presumption that art is on a path to ruin, which I don't exactly subscribe to as a curator invested for 10 years in showing work that I think is worth looking at. So yeah, our position is really taking one of imagining school as a space that is, perhaps a quick way to access a potential critical community that is, as much as it is about faculty, it is even more so about the students that attend that same space that you're in, having the opportunity to have the discussions that might prove productive in that period of time. As a curator, I can also say that there is very, very rarely a moment where I look at a recent school graduate and think that their practice is ready to go public. So again, I think we're taking the assumption on this panel that school doesn't create finished practices, that school is a sort of beginning place, and it has to be learning spaces that are co-created by students, and that might be one of the problems of art schools today, which has more to do with education in general, particularly high school education, and the sort of level of schooling that happens in high school education and not teaching students how to actually think for themselves. Because of course it's possible to be in art school and learn entirely through opposition, which is certainly my experience.
Let me add something. Also, it takes years to. No, we are under by 5 minutes. Also, it takes years to learn by yourself what you can learn in terms of principles, procedures, strategies, techniques in a semester first. So you save time by going to school, learning certain things, and then you go out there and make your work. Also, in the article there is an assumption, like the idea that artists that come out of schools, they write this impressive statement, but their work is not at the level. The point is here. Is the problem there in the case of the political, radical, or kind of like, shaky political radical statements that is not backed up by work, but the artwork or by the art proposal? Is that is that to blame the school, or we are talking here about a banalization of the radical, which is a different question?
There you go. They were better. He coughed first. Okay. So, you have 5 minutes to close.
Okay, closing. I need the man with the movie back there to come to the computer. So just to take what you were saying, the two kind of definitions you were talking about for why art school is great, which is access to a critical community and a place and the school as a place to begin thinking. And I guess these are our two problems with art school, is that it's too much of an access to a critical community and it's too much about thinking. And so I wanted to show this little video, which was made by a guy who went to art school and just took down things that people said about their own work and sort of clipped it all together to create a discussion on art coming out of art school. You gotta go back to the beginning. You're gonna have to pause it. You're gonna have to pause it and turn the sound on.
I know.
He's a graduate from school.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll start right at the beginning though.
Okay. And turn it up.
My practice is really about, like the ephemeral and the temporal and like just this juxtaposition between gesture and text and stillness and movement. And I really try to do it in a way that's like not over aestheticized, because like I really want to evoke this pure sense of nostalgia for the viewer, but the viewer, I mean, I don't even think about the viewer because I'm not like a sellout. But like that brings like this whole idea of commodification and like America and like how society is like so obsessed with consumption and capitalism. So I use a lot of green in my paintings, and like I had this one professor who like didn't get it because he probably didn't read like chromophobia and probably doesn't even like recycle or whatever. But like I'm basically just using this like reductive process of visual style, but it's like not stylized because I'm like not a graphic designer, like an illustrator or something. But like my work is really about like the non-objective, but like like externalized in the beholder's subjective experience. Really coming out of this provisional discourse and like very akin to artists like like Larrabee McNabb or like Diego Cotter or like Vervo Darashi, like you don't know their work? No, that's fine. Like you should really look them up though, because like I mean I don't know, whatever. Like at the end of the day, my work is really like an exploration of like the Apollonian and Dionysian and like these great dichotomies and like really unpacking these opposing forces and like exploring just like primal unity.
Okay, so that gives you an idea of what's being produced discursively. But we did have a little bit of technical difficulties.
Yeah, no, 2 minutes.
So moving from the head to the body, and I think moving from discourse to materials.
Okay. Oh boy. That guy had a lot to say. Did you already speak? I'm speaking again? Oh boy.
Closing, remember?
Oh yeah, that's gonna close it. The emphasis here is on a big close and on a big subject, which is arts education, not only in Canada but in North America and around the world. And as our esteemed colleagues pointed out, that this is a giant subject, and it's actually a subject that should be talked about from institution to institution. And I think that the people who are perhaps best suited to speak about this are the adjunct professors and those who are not tenured but who are underpaid, I should say, to inspire the youth of today, whether they be undergraduate or graduate. And the question of economy and commodity comes out and how much one is paid to participate in this community, and how much one pays to participate in a community. Once you graduate, once you're in the real world, of course we're all colleagues and it's a different matter. But the 27 seconds I have left, which are now 24 seconds, have quickly descended into a spiral of confusion amongst all of us, because I feel that on both sides our points have reached this middle ground where we both realize that arts education and the long history that it has eroded. And it does not mean that art is dead. It just means that art is...
About the YouTube video, the artist knows the language. He's able to draw. He's able to edit. He's able to filter the sounds, and it sounds beautifully. And he also knows the language that and is able to ironize about the language of art. And he is a graduate, so maybe he learned something at school. First. The function of education is to motivate and inspire. So,
Yeah.
that's it.
Okay.
Absolutely disagree.
I just want to make one other comment about that video, which is that, and this is something that I see over and over again in these kind of anti-education arguments, is that there's this constant leaning on the reduction of critical thinking to a stereotype of empty rhetoric, which I think is absolutely a fallacy as well, and is a result of students who don't take full participation and responsibility for their education within their learning environments, and occasionally bad instructor. Yes, there's bad writing that happens in art schools and in the art world, but that doesn't mean that, and I think it's a fundamentally anti-intellectual stance is what that video is.
I also think as someone who teaches in a PhD department of practice that I don't think there's a single person in art school, adjunct or not, who doesn't fight against the jargon. So it's not that we're dealing with that we're the problem recreating the jargon. I think it's that students at 20 are trying it on. And I think that, in order to kind of, you need the master's tools to deconstruct the kind of structure that we're all identifying, and I agree. This is about arts education, and it's the question really is also about, I guess I'll end on this provocation, because it's a vision that is potential, about if art school could be the place where, it's the place that draws the dropouts of engineering, and then other dropouts, and the coalescing of the possibility of this space that could be one that is revolutionary. It could be the spot where we think about it fomenting revolution and taking down this commodity form. So I think that art school could be this radical space, and I do, as someone who built an extra institutional framework for doing that, it was actually every single person in that group that started it had come out of art school and wanted to continue the kind of space that they had in art school for discourse. And I think that this is an amazing thing just to bring people together to talk about this. It doesn't mean you had to be in art school to be in that, but I think that it really brought people together. There aren't spaces, people build them, it's true, but the impulse and the experience in having a space often starts in art school. And so I'll just end there of this radical possibility of art schools, which we could take back.
I have a minute and 46 seconds.
Now we'd all like to defect to the yes team.
Wait, not, are you or not ready? No, there's one of us who loves education.
You have 1 minute and 29 seconds
Oh,
to
it's more than
tear it up. Go ahead, go
No,
ahead.
it's simple. Like at the end of the day, it's great the question because it's first of all it's a philosophical question, but it points beyond art education. It points to education in the society and the potential of education to change things. So it's really kind of like difficult to brain programs or art schools as a concept that we cannot define. At the end of the day, education should be a choice. It's out there. You use it or not. As an artist, you should know, and even as a young artist, you should know what you need. If you don't know, you go there. Yes, it costs money. It costs money also to the people that work in other things. But the reality is this: when you graduate, you are going to live with certain tools. Maybe you are not going to become a successful artist. Who determines that anyway? But you will have tools, and these tools will allow you also to do other things, like not only teaching, drawing, designing, filming. Maybe you become a cameraman, whatever, but this education that you got. But also, who said that the engineer that goes there or the architect is going to be the great new proposal? Maybe they just end up designing or doing AutoCAD in an office, but still, they got something out of their education.
Okay. With that, Andrew has an attitude problem and wants to rebut. Just very quickly. Very quickly. That's
I have an attitude problem, but that's another issue. No, I think that just what this conversation, because I'm listening to you and I'm hearing you. And I am disagreeing with you in part, but I also disagree with you in whole. I'm actually really curious about what art school education is and how we might describe it. Undergraduate, separate from MFA, and I find that at the MFA level, the lack of technical training, lack of technical skills, lack of technical information passed on versus the space given over to studio practice is quite damaging. Because as an artist, particularly an artist in a milieu where you are receiving support and feedback from colleagues and you're in conversation, and where your practice is expanding, with that expansion one would hope to find not just a community, but also practitioners who can help you to expand your abilities. And I feel that in the modes that I've seen in the schools I've visited and even attended, that if I wanted to learn, for instance, how to paint, that's something I should have learned as an undergraduate, or which I would have to learn in a night school class or in some other context. So my question is why art school, as much as it is about community, is also coming so much from, let's say, a visual or moving image into a verbal language capacity, where we're learning more to write, describe, and talk about art, versus the function of creating it and the tools that we need to do so. The other thing I think that is not really been talked about here, because we're so focusing so much on schools, is the professionalization of being artists. And how, obviously, for teaching purposes, if one wants to teach, you have to go through that graduation mill to get the paperwork, which will get you hired for an adjunct position or further on. But I really am curious in the long run, and this is for when the audience engages with this question, about when did art become a professional pursuit versus a creative pursuit or even a glorified hobby, and why is it a profession versus any of these other aspects of creative output? I had one more point, and I'm not entirely sure what it was at this point, but I think that my colleagues might also have an attitude problem.
I just wanted to add to that this whole separation between the creation of art and talking about art, I'm arguing that the process of going through the learning to talk about art changes the creation of art. So because institutions are embodied things, so we become different. We speak differently, we move differently, we have different cultures after. The idea that you can just walk in and walk out with just taking a little bit and not taking the whole culture of the place, I think is bunk.
Well, as everyone else here, I suppose at some point I could have joined the other side as well. But I think that it shouldn't be a binary system. There's an oppression that happens. I mean, art school is good, but there's an oppression that happens if you don't have that accreditation. That kind of work shouldn't be just used as outsider art or a separate definition of the non-accredited. That's okay.
I was just going to say, the other thing we haven't discussed here is the actual social networking and the networking of not even just social in the art world for career advancement, and the role that graduate art school plays for essentially mingling and pushing one's career further through social connection versus creative production.
Okay. Come on.
Yeah, no, just two questions. I agree that sometimes you go to a program, you don't learn what you want to learn, but are we confusing their programs with schools? Like when we talk about our schools, are we talking about our programs? No, I don't think so. There are certain programs that point to certain direction, and there are others. The second question is professionalization of probably both schools or society?
So, yes, sir? Yes?
No.
Yeah, I think that, I think there's no doubt that there are excellent points on the other side. And I think that the question about this breaking between creation and talking, I just want to challenge. Because I think the idea that we would, you can, there's a kind of, I think to relegate people to a place where their art is supposed to speak for them is actually something that does a disservice to the project of art. And I also think I would actually break this out from art. I would say culture. I think that culture too circulates in these institutions and is and in the institutions of the social. And I guess the question that I have really is about where are we going to talk about because I agree with this idea of professionalization, but where are we going to talk about the role or the function of art in the social? Like, where does that happen? Here, right? The possibility of us asking that question of, like, what can art do? And I feel like to say that art schools are the problem actually misdiagnoses the thing that, what is the function of art in society more broadly, and it's different in different communities and they're different art worlds. And it's true that there are institutions that provide access, they're gatekeepers, but then it's also true that some of us wouldn't get access to certain amazing thinkers and artists who are like lodged in these institutions so they didn't starve, earlier. And I feel like I definitely benefited from encounters with artists who made the choice that they didn't want to have their work, subject to the market, and they went and taught. And I think that yes, the institutional situations in terms of education are horrific, but it's not just in art schools that adjuncts are screwed. And I think that it does us a much better service to say that this is actually a problem with the education system about the situation of adjuncts and interns. What would it, to say that rather than to blame it on art school, I feel like, so many of the arguments that you're talking about are about the crystallization of some of these major social problems and that art looks like the biggest symptom. And I think that I heard recently, this last week, Dorothea Bremmer said a great thing about, like, why do we ask art to solve all of social problems? Like, isn't that a little unfair? If the rest of us can't solve, these problems, why do we ask art to do that? Why do we ask art schools to be better than any other educational institution? And I think it's partly because we want art to have some kind of special, exciting function. And I think that that's a good thing, and I think that's actually something that gets proliferated through this discussion. Because I don't think art can make that argument just for itself. I don't think it should have to. I think that we shouldn't just rely on a painting to prove art's function. I think we have to defend it. And I think that there are people in situations, we just see it all the time in terms of the defunding of acts of art. And I feel like we need people who can say, no, this is what we need, and I don't think like a Rothko does it, I don't think you just send that. I think you've got to have people who can speak on its behalf, and I think I have to say, I come from a situation in which I, value writing and speaking, and I think that we don't teach enough of that. And yes, the jargon is unbearable, but people have to try stuff out, and then I'm sure that someone after this told him he was full of shit. Right? So the other thing I want to say is that I spent 5 years unlearning what I learned in grad school, and I feel like that was probably the best thing I did, right? That was the oppositional ideas that I learned in grad school were important to me, and I feel like that's something that's we need to embrace, and I even embrace it in all of you. That you're a feeling of objecting, and that art schools as an institution have brought you together to they're serving a function in society just because you guys have coalesced and talked about how horrible they are.
So, at this point, we're going to put it out into the audience. Now, I'm not a debater per se, I'm just a little chick in the middle, but
She's been egging me on the whole time, telling me that they're winning, and she hasn't been saying that to them.
Yeah, 'cause you have no best What I want to do is put it out to the audience, but I also have my own kind of question as a non-debater, but it's, again, chick in the middle. I want to know whether or not this whole question is fundamentally elitist at its core. Just for this, I believe in the coincidence of timing when we have these kind of questions, when notions of the redundancy of education come into play, particularly when other people, marginalized communities just get access, and how this comes from, how we get here. And then again, looking at the makeup of the room. Who is here, who isn't here. So really, with everything that's been said, it's this moment to throw this, what I believe to be fundamentally elitist question out to the audience to get your feedback, your insight about whether or not you believe that art education or art schools are killing art. So, questions? And do we have a microphone out there? No?
No, we ran out of microphone.
Okay.
Here, so you can come up here,
You
you
take
guys.
one of these, we'll share. So I guess the deal is you're gonna have to come up to the front. I'm sorry, love.
Or shout it. We might take it together.
Well, now you've got backbone. Yeah, she's like, take
Does
responsibility.
anyone want to buy me a Guinness?
Nice.
Hey, my opinion is that arts education opens your mind. It's not something, it adds to what you can think. It adds another point of view that not necessarily is the one that you have to accept. You get the education opens your mind, and later you start to look your own way or your own passage too. It's not that you have to follow. You don't have to be brainwashed by what you are taught in university, anywhere in the world. It's not just here. It's all universities around the world try to give you their point of view. So later, and I think in history, fortunately, things have changed thanks to people who were thinking their own way too. It's not that, it doesn't mean that if you don't get an education, you cannot think. But it adds to what you can do, or you can write or think, That's my point of view.
Omar agrees with you.
There is a difference, fundamental difference between education and brainwashing, watching. So I totally agree.
Any other questions from the audience? Andrew?
I can project, but I'll use the mic of it for recording.
No, it's not even. Make sure we're not into the PA. We're not into the PA.
We're not the PA, we're not the PA.
Oh, project away. Okay, on that note.
All right.
Go I just think agency, individual agency.
Just use the mic.
Okay, I just think individual agency of individuals who choose post-secondary education and art seems to be missing a little bit here. I think there are individuals who may well go there, and they feel maybe a lot of it may be manipulated by manipulated instructors, and they feel like they have to have certain jargon in order to be impressive. But I also think there is agency. You make a decision to get an education, you can play the system. There is latitude, there is ways that you can get the school to work for you, get the legal to work for you, and do not separate techniques from the body. And I'm saying this as a talking head who doesn't even have a body, except on special occasions, and who didn't go to art school.
Anyone else in the audience that has any comments to throw at this? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I was sort of, when listening to the pro art school team, I started thinking about what they were talking about and how they're sort of talking about this utopian art school that I really want to go to. I don't know about anyone else. But, and then I sort of started comparing it to both my experience going through art school and being a part-time professor in various institutions here, and sort of thinking about how what you guys are arguing for doesn't necessarily exist in practice. And I started thinking about how it starts and how we bring students into some of the institutions I work at. And the programs I teach in are very popular, and we maybe have sort of 1,000 people apply for 50 spots or something insane like that. And so before I even get to talk to these students or interview these students or see their work, one of the things we do with these 18-year-old students coming out of high school is just chop their grades. So anyone under like 85%, I'm not even going to talk to. I'm not going to see their work. I'm not. And so the kind of kids I'm talking to are 18-year-old kids that have gotten 90% in high school, 95% throughout high school. And these sorts of kids, you know, maybe they have an art portfolio, a filmmaking portfolio, and so they've been in an institution where they had access to fancy cameras, or they have parents that have, you know, allowed them to sort of have cameras and these sorts of things. So the type of kids I'm talking to that haven't even come into the program yet are so, many of them are in a very privileged place, and many of them are those kids that are, you know, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, showing up to class on time. So this idea that art school is a place for rebels and sort of just to quote, dropouts from other areas or other parts of society that feel they're fighting against some kind of power, it's hard to find that in the student body sometimes. And I think that has to do with particular ways in which the institution works, ways that we classify who's a good student, who should be coming here. And so I just wanted to complicate the matter and talk about that and take away, and not talk about this utopian art school, and start talking about like what's actually going on in schools that's problematic. So yeah, I just want to open that together.
That is a question, and I think it's interesting that we assumed naturally that we were talking about post-high school education, and that we weren't talking about the community-based art school that does service the students that you're talking about, that don't get into institutions. So I think that's an interesting thing to kind of bring forward, and then from there, Mike.
Yeah, I'll try and project. And I think the major problem that people are dealing with here is the problem of discourse as bullshit, right? I mean, that was the impetus for Chris Gaiman's original intervention, and this is in some ways the crux of the debate. And in some ways, the problem with bullshit is, in fact, someone wrote a great book about bullshit called Bullshit. And bullshit is a particular kind of untruth. And it's a rhetorical statement that on some level seems plausible to some degree until someone calls you on it. The problem right now, and this is true in any field, but including the art world perhaps especially, is that there's something at stake if you call someone on bullshit, right? So there's good discourse and bad discourse everywhere. But in art school, when you're dealing with authority, you've got a professor and a student, there's a power relationship there, and the student often has to talk the talk in order to get the grades and so on. There's a reward structure and also a punitive structure there if you don't fit in that. I also think within the professional art world, where there is a market, there's a lot at stake on calling a curator on their bullshit. You don't tell the curator of MoMA, I think your curator statement is bullshit, right? You're never going to get into the MoMA that way. So on some level, within the art world, there is a way in which a particular discourse can be done badly. And no one is actually using the critical skills we learn in school to call people on that level of bullshit. I think it's not a question of is art school killing art? Are people in school learning how to question this language and call people on bullshit?
Yes.
Hi. I'm gonna talk about 3 points, and one is art school at a elementary school level. I have the 11-year-old kid who's really artistic, and he went to the gifted program after trying to find a place where he will fit with his, very absent-minded cloudiness, daydreaming, whatever, and failing math and everything else. But now it is the gifted program at this really good school. At first, he's also put down because he's not good at math, at science. He's a great artist, but that's not a good thing. That's something that the professors and the teachers really don't value. You need to be good at math, you need to be good at this, but art is really not one of the priorities. And so this is one of the things that I wanted to touch upon, that is a systematic problem with the education at large. 2, grad school. I went to grad school, and what I found is that not all the work for all artists are informed by the amazing philosophers and the books that you write and discuss in the classroom. Maybe your artwork is more intuitive or is informed by other currents or ways of thinking than the ones that the Eurocentric culture dictates, especially for minorities. So it's really hard for us to defend in perfect English our work and not being upset by the authority, the professors telling you that's wrong, or go this way, or whatever other way. And the last one is, so what do you do when art school tells you your thesis, your film, your project is not validated yet, you can't graduate, but your peers tell you, and you travel with it, and you do go to conferences, and you present your work in progress, and everybody loves it. So what is the compromise here? That's it.
Hang on a second, Mama's gonna respond.
Oh, I just want to, this is on my mind. Just something you said sparked something. Because I am a curator as well, so I wear the critical hat too. But I'm thinking about the way in which Chris Gaiman's article, and for those who haven't read it, it doesn't matter. I shouldn't say that. But anyway, the whole discussion of language and how we talk about art is important precisely because the kind of art that can be discoursed on extensively in certain kinds of philosophies, certain kinds of ways of talking about art, it has to be quite empty, and it has to be a small gesture. It has to be, it's a kind of art that actually produces certain kinds of critical discourse quite easily. And I think that what you were talking about in terms of thinking about people who work from materials, people who work intuitively, and people who do not want to talk about their art. They do not, right? And I'm working with an artist who's like that, Rebecca Belmore. She hates talking about her work. She does not want to be critical. She doesn't want to enter those things. She left art school. Now she's got an honorary PhD from that same art school, which is funny. But these are the kind of artists, I guess, that I'm interested in, because it actually makes it hard for you to write about it too. As much as it's hard for them to talk about it, it becomes hard to write about it, and all those kind of standard ways that you write about art aren't necessarily so easily applied in that situation, and I think it actually, that kind of work resists critical thinking in a sense, because it's coming from a different place, like from the body, it's coming from all these different ways of knowing the world, that it doesn't translate to speech, and that's what, and doesn't translate to speech so easily, and I think that's what excites me about this space of art making. Just me, man.
Do
But
that
I'm not saying all other art is bad, okay? Let's just get that clear.
Okay. Do that apply to everybody?
I just want to say that that was really well said.
And I drop off to school too.
Yes.
I mean, it really was. I meant that totally sincerely. It really was. And that's precisely what I'm talking about. Because I agree.
This is going to take it away.
This is where it becomes murky in the middle. As somebody who is also with Rebecca and who is at that institution as well, just because Rebecca doesn't speak about her work doesn't mean that it's not coming from a place of criticality, and that we can and critical discourse as well. But the discourse is in the work. The discourse is in the work. So when we're talking about what happens in art school, actually, it's a whole complex of things that are going on when students are encountering their own intuitive impulses. They're learning techniques and technologies and a whole different kind of material language and culture. They're encountering a whole slew of history theory. They're going out to the beers, to have beers and having a whole social network that they're working through in terms of doing whatever they're doing. But socially, that also informs. So when we talk about art school, it's a huge kind of context, and from what I see in terms of the kind of relationship that's fostered, at least within the window that I have within the institution, the encouragement is for those students, and I tell our thesis students, what we're doing, asking you to do is very difficult. It's to go into the work, be inside it, be intuitive, and then step out, think and expose yourself to a critical perspective, go back in. And so it's this constant relationship of going in and out of the work and being in it. And that's where that discourse happens. So it's not seeing the language or whatever language it is, whether it's visual or textual or whatever, as separate necessarily, but that we're using different skills to be in it. But it's really about developing your own language, as it were, and whatever that way we want to talk about that. But I do agree with the point being made about bullshit, because we all have that struggle with seeing text that is totally alienating, and that's the problem
Heather has a statement, but I wanted to just quickly, is there anybody in the room that is teaching outside of the university system, say people who are doing community-based work? Anyone?
I have.
So can any of you speak to this question of whether or not art school is killing art? I'm particularly concerned or interested in this idea that community-based art education is really something other, that we're really talking about a literacy discussion. So I'm throwing that out to you to think through while I give the microphone over to Omar.
Also, are there any art students in the room?
Are there any art students in the room?
That's my question too.
Also. I suppose you want to hear them.
I want to know if there's one person in this room that's not in art school, that didn't go to art school, that doesn't teach in an art school, that didn't get an MFA or a BFA. I want to know if there's any single person in this room that has no art.
God
Okay,
And we're practicing.
I just wanted to comment on,
Don't go there.
Yeah.
Don't go there.
on her perspective, like this idea at school, right? Yeah, I can agree with that. I can agree with that. That ideal institution doesn't exist. So when we are contesting that ideal, what are we talking about? We are talking about, an ideal. So isn't that ideal in the making and balance and expanding of programs? Since that ideal school that is going to teach you all what you need doesn't exist, then maybe it's in the balance of everything, like in terms of programs, where you get something, you get something here, you go to a different program, and then that would complete an education. That's what another school would be, that doesn't exist, per se.
Programs and structures.
Right.
And,
And in terms of the bullshit, I will say this. Let them make their mistake. Let them make their mistakes.
But then call it up. Call
it out. Because the point is this, you have many architects and many engineers out there that also come with these ideas that can understand by themselves. So artists will develop on their own knowledge and their own practice. The idea is this, as an artist you have the responsibility of going out there and fighting your space. A lot of them, especially artists to be, will make a lot of mistakes, but that mistakes is part of their education.
And I also just think there's so much bullshit in our culture, and there are not that many places where we're trained to call people out on it, or where the stakes, quite honestly, in the framework of school, they're low. There's the A, but that's, and you gotta learn somewhere. You gotta start somewhere and learning how to call people on their bullshit.
Maybe there is a problem with art schools, but what I think that the problem that art schools have is that what they exclude. It's not so much the information that they give, but the information that they don't give. And that is executed by art schools. Are not, they're institutions. They think, and they're made by people and teachers and people. So it's what all this work excludes in their investigation. I do work with youth in excluded communities, and I also teach a course at York Video. And the ones that we do with in communities, we do them in 2 weeks, 10 days sometimes. They produce incredible works, and the ones that I teach at York, they last longer, and they're more difficult to teach.
Why?
Apathy. The schools are really, the students are not well informed. They get more courses to go to. It's a business, right? Universities are creating conformism in some ways. That's what they are for, to repeat knowledge. No, really, you can do whatever you want to do with it and challenge it, but the function of an institution is to survive as an institution, and it should be to be that institution, and exclude.
So then, are we really, at the root of this, is there really a question about whether or not our institutions are conducive to political change? Is that where this is going? Is that what we're talking about? Is a divide of this idea that art outside of the institution is fundamentally political and has the agency that we speak to, and that somehow you get into the institution and that kills it? Is that what we're talking about?
The problem.
Josh,
Let's hear the students. Let's hear the students. Come on, and then Eric's in the back, okay? Go ahead.
Oh God.
Okay, your time is up, thank you.
Okay, so in terms of, I'll get to the art and politics thing. I think that's. So I would have been exposed to. I had exposure, but I had the privilege of being really exposed to art and experimental film in my undergraduate. I don't think I would have really gotten into it otherwise. Most of the people that I studied with in my undergraduate did not go on to pursue it, and I think that a large part of it is what the goals of the students are, and what sort of stakes that they have when they're into it. That said, I took 6 years, and I originally wanted to take 10 years before going back to school for my graduate, and doing so I think is the most masturbatory thing that I've ever done, which I feel good about it. But there are many, there are many people in the in my graduate program who have not made work outside of school, and I think who've not practiced outside of a structured academic context. I think that's a big problem. I also run workshops, film workshops outside of academic institutions, and I think that it's really what you want to. I think it's hard to be really general about this because it's based on the individual. It's based on where you're learning. You can be totally self-made, self-educated, and be really great, or you can still be terrible, make terrible art. I think in terms of political art, that gets really tricky. I think that there's a reluctance in my program. There's not a lot of aggressively political art. It tends to get pigeonholed. I think that this is a question of, then you get into venues and intent and ideology. I don't have an answer, or I guess it's a comment rather than a question.
Eric's in the back.
I just had a question for Ross actually, because I didn't know. Were you around when Roy Ascott was at OCA? Because it seems like Roy was really maybe the last director to kind of change art school as a concept, and it's kind of sad that was 40 years ago, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of art schools, you know.
Sarah Diamond's not here.
Sarah might get upset with that comment here.
I'm trying to figure out what I was doing.
Just along that line, sorry. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
When trying to figure out what I was going to say today, I thought, gee, is that like prehistoric, OCA in 1972. But I kept thinking of it as a reference. I also recently saw, to even go back further, Ron Mann's documentary on Rochdale. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
And so these are great models, I think, for, in many cases fail, but hey, failure's good. The Rochdale documentary, if you haven't seen it, you should. It's very much about what we're discussing today. The Ascot years at OCA, that was my first year at OCA, 1972, and the entire transcripts from the college are blank in terms of grades, right? And that was the best situation in any institution I've ever come across for art school situations. He came in, as I recall, and fired half the faculty. Faculty that hang around too much in these institutions become overweight and secure. They're paid too much, and they have such a feeling that they deserve this position and this authority, and it's not a living entity when they hang around too long. So anyway, Ascot used to. He wanted teachers there that were involved in whatever they were doing in the world, and they would just drop in. In terms of craft, he wanted to have videotapes in the library so people could learn how to throw a pot or whatever. They didn't have to waste salary time on that. And our best classes were, I'm a little nostalgic actually, they were in the Beverly Tavern, where you actually learn by example, by working artists, and you figured the angles and you learned how to think and you figured out how you're going to make your way in this world. And not think you're going to be an artist who depends on the incestuous academy to continue your work. You want to be clean and pure. Can I say that? And keep your work unsullied by thank you. The filthy lucre of the either the market in America or the various government castration councils that keep everyone in line and keep them from blowing things up. Now we all know that artists are self-centered and hate each other, and
So we have a system here where they've got a small, like peanuts, they throw peanuts out. And rather than the artists actually thinking about fighting existing structures, whatever, they fight each other over these peanuts. And it's very pathetic. I went from the art school to SEAC, speaking of peanuts. And, we found out how the arm's length, the relationship between the councils and the art community, how long the arm was. Because, again, is this ancient history? Do any of you is ringing a bell, SEAC?
It's ringing a bell, sweetie darling. We'll speak up into the microphone.
So anyway, when we went about our artistic activity, our political artistic activity, we soon were not officially charged with terrorism, but we did have the Royal Canadian Mounted Police tapping each other's phones. And so anyway, that went under. And by the way, we got many letters from the arts community here in Toronto saying that art and politics have no place together. And that's a fact.
That's because you believe in the fallacy of the community.
Yes, I mentioned that before with the peanuts.
That's the Tom Berner Award winner.
And more
What does that mean for non-Canadians? What did you just say?
Well, I'm sorry.
American, I have no idea what that means.
We'll talk later. But so then, as part of this community educational pursuit, whatever, I started an organization called The Funnel, and it was an extension of my studies at the Art College. I wanted a place for artists to go, a greenhouse where they could make films and produce films and make outer space thinking. And we were doing that for a couple of years. By the way, we had to prove we weren't terrorists after all. I had to be, a good boy for a couple of years there. And first thing we know, we had of course, the Ontario Censor Board came down on us. Yeah, I guess they're still around, aren't they? So I personally, I had been in Mary Brown's office. She was the head censor of the Ontario Censor Board at the time. And I asked her to describe to me exactly what could be censored by the film, what was bothering her, whatever. And she sat there and proceeded to spell out all the dirty words she could think of. She said, well, you can't say F-U-C-K in your films, and you can't say, it was very surreal. What I'm describing is, I guess, one thing after another, and just trying to be an artist in this milieu, and always kind of banging my head against the wall. It's just, we took the government to court, the Censor Board to court the day after Pierre Trudeau signed the Constitution with Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, and about a week and a half after that, we had the building inspector, the theater inspector, the soap dish inspector, the urinal inspector. Everyone was down in our little organization trying to put us under. I could go on and on. I may weep. At any rate, I got a ticket for riding my bike without a light in the daytime, and then I got another jaywalking ticket. And I thought maybe I wasn't born in the right country to be an artist and be able to function. And I left in 1986. But I'm glad to see that all of these problems have been solved, and everybody's happy now. And we have a room full of happy artists. Is that enough?
Anyone else in the audience?
I'd like to add something. The question is elitist. Yes, Deanna, to answer your question. When Sharon Shot was here a few years ago showing her first feature film, one of the questions from the audience afterwards said, so are you going to keep making feature films or go back to the museum? And she said, the experience of making a feature film and presenting something in multiple screens all over the world where people can pay $10 or the equivalent and just come in and experience something really shifted something for her, that she felt that the museum world, from her perspective, makes people feel like they have to have a PhD, were her words. There's all this pressure to be at a certain level to be able to experience art. And it really was quite profound for me, which is not to say I love all of her art either, but I thought it was this really interesting kind of point around, again, access and you know, a lot of economic issues have been raised and a lot of, you know, late capitalist issues, but no one's mentioned student debt, and no one has, I mean, look, if you want to be an accountant, you have to go and get something that gives you the tools to be an accountant. You want to be a truck driver, you go to a truck driving school. When did it become like the norm to, you have to go to an MFA program to be an artist? I mean, we get thousands of submissions at Image every year, we're very lucky. And I read applications for people who want to get grants to make work, and I think, like, where did we go wrong? Like, the writing about art, it makes me not want to watch or make art. Like, I find it very upsetting, which is not art school's fault either. I mean, I think we've all kind of agreed with that, so I'll just stop there.
Anyone else in the audience?
Yeah, I was waiting, but I have, you know, when everyone loves the film festival, less than a question, then a comment, and 17 points. Actually, just a couple points. You know, we talked a bit about, you know, jargon and whatever, and one of the words that's now thrown around and I hear all the time is practice, practice, practice. And I like that in terms of art school, in art school being a place where you practice and you get better, and then you move on to something greater than the school. And also this question, is art school killing art? I mean, I live in San Francisco and we have CCA, and I think we all need to be aware of the nefarious rise of curatorial studies. Curatorial studies is, you know, I mean, more curators than artists these days, and, you know, it's problematic. The other thing that might be killing art, James Franco. So God bless him, and I hope he does it.
No, I just want to respond to you an answer that I think that it makes sense why artists are going to, you know, do MFAs and PhDs, as in my case, is because I say it reveals very much the precarious financial possibilities that artists have. So universities have become sort of a search for going to getting paid and having time to do some work, and it is, and you see more and more artists, already established artists, doing that transition into universities.
Oh, I'm just really interested in, Mike brought it up, and it's echoed throughout, this notion of bullshit and talking about bullshit and acknowledging it, and the lack of agency that a lot of us feel to do it, and the penalty that occurs by Sazi when that does happen. And I'm not sure that, I mean, it's not courage. I think courage is a word that I would use with, like, firemen, not with artists. But I think that there's something there that I know that I have made in my institutional position in Economic Archives. I have made enemies of curators who propose programs that are not, although written in English, discernible, and I have no clue what they're talking about. And by having told them that you need to simplify, that is actually something that across the realm of arts training we can say is that communication is what is essentially missing in so much as both from the educator to the student, but also from, I'm glad that Jeff acknowledged both James Franco's rise to influence, and of course without him, Spring Breakers wouldn't even have been half the film that it was. An amazing film, by the way. My favorite of last year. But I think that this curator issue is probably should be on the debate here next year about the rise of the curator, the artist curator, the curator, the curator as artist, the Hans Ulbricht model of it. In fact, Paul Chan is about to publish a book of Hans Ulbricht's telephone doodles and notes that he takes during meetings, of course, which complicates the question of art and curator. But in curatorial studies and in my relations as an artist, but also as a let's say, arts administrator to curators, I think that we as artists and as educators and as students have to educate not just the public, but also the curators as to what they are talking about, and to take the power away from their language and to bring them down to a proletarian level of sorts. I think that, especially Word Images, this is a festival largely dedicated to moving images. How many film curators or curators of arts actually understand the technical process of filmmaking, film projection, or film exhibition? I have had so many conversations for the last 15 years trying to explain to people that films are projected, generally speaking, in dark rooms, and where sound is isolated from other works on display. And that is something which I cannot tell you how many times is a regulatory statement. I really think that this obviously is a consensual problem, but one where we're talking about the institutions, but I think that we are all educators in a way, and that we should be sharing our knowledge with others and educating those who actually want to frame us and where our work goes and where our work lives and what our work is as a commodity.
Yeah, this is sort of following on with what Scott was talking about. I was going to get to some of what you were talking about. For most of the Canadian artists who I assume have applied for grants, which is what you're referring to, for the non-Canadian artists, correct me if I'm wrong, most of the arts applications, they ask you to prove your academic qualifications to get an arts grant. Am I
or equivalency?
No, it's not true at all.
Not true?
You have to show professional practice.
You have a CV that can include your education, but your CV indicates what you've done, where you've shown your work, blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
You can be self-taught.
Independent of the educational.
But the other thing I was going to touch on was in terms of, am I right that everybody up on the panel has also been a curator at one, has curated? No, have most people on the panel curated in some fashion, curated? Yes?
Yeah.
Have you ever rejected anybody because they weren't academically qualified?
No. God, no.
This is not going well for you.
I think we're maybe the wrong room of kind of curators.
No, I'm just curious if anybody ever has. Because I've had many artists tell me that they were rejected
Yes.
due to their lack of academic qualifications.
That sounds like bitter artists, Adam.
No, I would.
Okay, this is better artists, but these are several.
I'll back you.
Maybe for professional hires, but not for
No, for exhibition or for, I'm just curious if anybody's actually said, well.
I might just expand on what you're saying and maybe expand it from educational background to possibly academic style discourse, because this has been a problem for art, like having worked at the Ontario Arts Council, working with artists of color and working with Indigenous artists. The number one factor in them not getting grants for a long time before we changed some of the stuff was that even juries of artists wanted them to talk about their work in a specific way. And they may not have known the language of this place, and it has become institutionalized to a certain degree, even for getting an arts grant. So I would back you up there in that sense. I would say yes, that is a problem. It was a barrier, it is a barrier still. There's still a kind of academicization of arts language that has happened even in grant writing. So I think that's still a barrier, and if you don't think it's a barrier, maybe you speak that way.
Hi, I'm Nix. I was an artist, and an artist at art school killed her art. I left in 2007, I dropped out my MFA because I lost my voice. I was making a film to make happy my professors and to graduate and have a thesis and an MFA degree, and I didn't like the work and what it turned into. So I ran out of money, and I had two little ones, two boys, so I decided to leave, and happily became an arts administrator. Then I got a grant, a Compass grant, through the Ontario Arts Council, and I wanted to update my skills as an arts administrator because I studied film back home, but I didn't know how to administrate an organization. So I went to York and I took all these courses like English for business and not-for-profit management and all the stuff. And what my experience in the last four years has been is
that I've learned a ton more serving as a board director for the Media Arts Network of Ontario, Panorama, than going back to school.
How much time have I got?
Let's send it to Scott, because they have the next event. We're
1, 2, how many other people are looking for a comment? 1, 2, 3? 3, okay.
On the subject of death, and this idea of killing art and the incredible resilience of art. And that maybe art needs to die sometimes. Maybe it's important to go to school and have a shit kicked out of you and have your delusions, put forward, your delusions. And then if you're there, if you're invested in it, you're gonna rise above it. And so in a way, I teach drawing and painting, if you want to laugh. It's really nice being around technology-minded people. But in terms of the death of painting, which is just this constant discussion, but it persists, just like art persists. And I think that it's really healthy for it to be challenged on an ongoing basis, and including the institution. But the institution needs to be challenged, interrogated, and just messed with to give a chance for new things to rise out of the crust.
There's a question back there. 2? Scott's taking over now. You're on.
Art. What's damaging to art? What do we mean? Are we talking about the art market or institutionalized art? The 800-pound gorilla in the middle of the room here is that what's threatening to art or inflecting art is not art schools, really, it's investment capitalism and flipping art in these commercial markets. And that has nothing to do with most of what we've been discussing. But that's the major difficulty. On the other side of it, in the 1950s, there was a perhaps much smaller cadre of people doing art, and they were, first of all, like notoriously in New York at least, centered in a boys' club at the Cedar Bar. And there was an insider group that was, it seems, to some degree, as we're now learning, permeated and regulated by the CIA. So there was a coherent effort to use art as a political tool of national policy by the United States. And this was enabled under those circumstances. What happened? In the late 70s, there was a proliferation of arts programs, and the consequence was heresies and the infusion into the scene of many women and others, a diversification, in short, of what artists were and what they were doing. That's all I have to say, but I did want to point out, I was his teacher in art school, and he seemed to like it. And now it turns out he's a goat leading the sheep to slaughter.
I'm just like you, Tony. No. Go ahead. Tony?
Yeah, he's been teaching the same school.
Yeah, Tony's the problem, really. And this guy, there it is, starts in the, what is it, early 1970s, and he's there, he's in Buffalo, he's in where you're in Ohio, right? You're really like, what can I say?
Yes, no, and then Mike.
I think Rebecca has had this question for a long time. I'd like to hear from Rebecca.
Thank you.
Kate's always
You stop talking.
Kate's always my cheerleader. Thank you, Kate. So I was really interested in something Scott said, and he brought up the idea of this amount of student debt that student goes into, very much more in the U.S. And then I also wanted to think about a point that was brought up, where art school or the institution in general has very low stakes, and I don't think that's true. I think that's true for the privileged that have enough sort of cash around to pay their tuition and pay for all their supplies. But for those of us that were on scholarships, those of us that needed to work within that institute, work within the system, and I benefited a lot from that. I want to say that I loved art school and I benefited a lot from it. But I did have to fit within a particular kind of structure because I was dependent on scholarships, and I couldn't have gone to art school without them. And so there's a certain amount of a lot of my time in art school was spent finding little pockets of grants and scholarships, and I'm like, well, I don't really make this kind of work, but I can make it sound like I make this kind of work. And I really learned how to talk about my work in a way that would bring in the cash in art school. That was like half of what I did. I hustled. I learned to hustle in art school, and I learned that along with making work. But that upsets me because I think the idea that there's no stakes that's a very privileged position. That's like half the, maybe half of the student populace feel that way. But for those of us that needed to maintain like A's or whatnot, there's a lot at stake because you might be kicked out of school if you, start working against the system.
Michael, if you just indulge me, I just want to speak to that. I thought, and this is like an unusual thing to perhaps say in this room, but I thought art school was the best career decision I could have ever made. But I say that as a black lesbian radical freak that tears up shit, right? So it was a really great thing for me to do. And I mean this in all sincerity, I went to art school to understand how the system works so I could take it apart. So it was a very important thing for me. This idea of stakes, to my knowledge, there is not a single tenured black person in a studio program in the country. So the stakes were particularly high for me in that sense. So I keep coming back to this question of whether or not this is a fundamentally elitist question. There are people that are busting their asses to get into the institution, to change the system and change everything that we're talking about. And there was a question around accreditation and when does anybody turn down. I have been rejected more with the credentials that I now have than I ever did before I ever went to art school. There is a place for the quote-unquote uneducated savage in the commercial art world. There is absolutely that place. But once somebody like me that gets an education, that gets into the system, all of a sudden the rules tend to change. Go figure. So the MFA that was the end of my, the terminal degree that was acceptable when I got into the institution is no longer the terminal degree, and we're talking about the PhD. So again, I keep coming back to this core question that started this debate, at least for me, which is acknowledging the timing of these kind of questions. And so again, I just want to come back to this idea that it was a really great, yes, we could have this debate about the problems of art school being about skills and about job preparation and all that kind of stuff, but that was incredibly vital for me. So, Mike, come back to you. Mike's ready.
No, I didn't have my hand up.
No?
So I'm just nodding vigorously.
The other thing that I wanted to make to speak about was that the guys in history, the artists in history, that really had success were those who really contested the academic thinking of the moment. That they brought change. For example, after the, let's say, 18th, 19th, and 20th century in France, for example. Those who continue to continue the academic thinking, nobody remembers about them. What were the people that we will remember is those who made the changes that were a revolution in art. especially in the 20th century.
Yeah, yeah. Still, any question?
I have lots of comments I could make and lots of questions, but I'll try to keep it simple. Maybe this is directed more towards the yes side. And I'm wondering, is your opposition or criticism of art school, or the answer to your question is art school killing arts, is it a theoretical problem? Like, are the hierarchies inherent in a kind of education, is that the root of the problem? Or is it something that's just practical given the climate of, say, the academy's relationship to the market, or the hierarchy of the curator over the artist, or the text over the image? Like, are these just kind of current problems that could be fixed? Or is it at the root of, you can't teach creativity, you can't teach, maybe you can teach someone how to read, but can you teach someone how to be a good reader? Or like these kind of, or just the hierarchy of the student-teacher. Like, is that the root of the problem? Or are they just practical problems where they could sort of be fixed and mended given the situation?
I mean, for me, I think it's, we're all being so general here, but, and that question has a lot to do with individual programs for me, and
So it's in that sense, it's practical. There's better,
Well, it's structural. I mean, I think that's the thing, is that when you say, sorry. No, I think it's structural. I think that the points we're making actually are that the symptom problems, the main problems, are stuff that's not just practical, it's these things that are dyed in the wool about education and access. These are the things that people are really raising about art school, both as something that has the potential to provide ways in, and then is also prohibited just by even not letting people in the door.
But if that was changed, if all school in every discipline was free, would that change the problem of the hierarchy of the student-teacher? And more people have access, but would there still be a root problem? And is that still a problem? Is that one of the biggest problems, or is it just accreditation and access is the biggest problem?
Well, I mean, there's so many problems. I don't think all art schools are bad, and I obviously think that there are issues around theory-based practice that irk me versus experiential practice, experiential, singular relationships to art. I think of experiences I had before I went to college. I think of being a very young kid and going to the library and seeing the cover of Captain Beefheart's Trout Mask replica, and it blowing my mind, and then taking the record home and being 4 sides of unlistenable music. That was for me this beacon. And then years later, seeing Michael Snow's Wavelength, and I don't even remember what the teacher said. It was the experience of watching Wavelength that was so radical, and I've seen it I don't know how many times since. Every single time I get something else out of it. And that is something that is a one-to-one relationship. And I feel that like trying to theorize that and to teach me on how I should watch Wavelength, or I should watch Piece by Tony that was really revelatory to me, No Europe. I mean, the concept behind that was just such a mindfuck to me that it spun me in a new direction. And I think that I'm not saying I want to study great masters or only singular works, but studying French authors writing about literature transposed onto arts has always failed me in a relationship to experience of looking at or experiencing those arts directly. For me, staring at a Clifford Still painting for as much as an hour is as revelatory as listening to somebody talk about it to me and tell me about it. And also the thing I like to point out here.
The CIA made good art.
What?
The CIA made good art.
The CIA makes some pretty fine art, but I also think that the thing that we lack, and that was very influential to me, always has been anecdotal, the histories around art and around artists and around the production of art versus theoretical dissections of that art.
Back up, sister. Back up.
Just briefly.
Well, he still gets me.
Go ahead.
I was first, actually.
Go ahead.
No, there's two men around me, they gotta speak first. I'm kidding, go ahead, go ahead.
Wow, you just totally did that.
Oh yeah, you are white.
I'm Jewish. Holy mixed company, go ahead.
Oh, now he really can't because I ruined it for him, sorry. And now I don't want to either. No, but what I was gonna say and now it's all confused because there's other stuff that's been said, but in relation to writing, too, I believe the same thing as what you're saying. I think when I think about writing about art, one of the hardest things to do is to let the art speak on its own behalf in some sense, and to not impose all of my knowledge and all of my thinking and everything onto it before I'm listening to it or sitting with it or doing. I think even for critical writing that's important, that sort of other way of being. And I also think related to you, what you're talking about, what is the problem? For me, I guess the problem is fundamentally education. It is, for me, it's a system that is imposed from an outside culture. It's a system that comes from certain values, certain ways of building the world that I don't agree with, nor do a lot of people in my culture agree with. We actually have a culture of education that's experientially based. We have an idea of thinking that is based in the body, includes the heart, includes the mind. It's not Cartesian, you know, it's not, we don't have these divisions that are the same. And language is something, you know, I read Lacan, I love Lacan, but I don't agree. Because for us, everything comes from the body, from the earth, right? So even words, the words actually come from certain places inside the body. So it's not that the world was built by language. It was built by the body's relationship to the land and to other things. So for me, education fundamentally is fucked up because its value system on which it's based is fucked up. So even though we're trying so hard to change it, I think structurally we need to shift it out of, so much of it is like structural too, right? Like classrooms and all this way of doing things. The individuals in them are not necessarily the problem, although some of them are, but not all of them. And so I think that, yeah, students, teachers, you know, take it out of that structure and let's see what the fuck we can produce.
Yeah, Al, and we really do have to wrap it up, so I'm gonna leave it with you, Al.
No way.
Do you want the mic?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I would echo very much of what you've been speaking about in your address around structural issues. And I think that one of the questions is really what are the forces that might be killing the art school? Because, and where you started with around the neoliberal forces that are at play within the education system is really significant at this time, such that the programs that are coming in that are going against studio learning, for example, that are weighting more and more theory and history and text and all of that kind of learning versus experiential learning and studio learning and material-based and all of that. Those are big forces in the institution that I teach in at this point, such that faculty have to fight for studio-based learning. And experiential learning now means, in my institution, the placement, what we've called placement, you know, going out in co-op or internships, that's what they're calling experiential learning, which bugs the shit out of me, but it's one of those things that really is about undermining what art school education is. The biggest issue here I think, is about the economies that we are dealing with and the structural nature of the institution and how inevitable administration has co-opted the whole education in terms of the politics of it. So it's really important to actually be more subversive within the institution and outside of the institution. And I think those are the things that we haven't talked about enough in terms of the politics of art itself, so.
So, on that note, I'm sorry, I absolutely have to wrap this up.
Lucy Raven, 5 p.m. at the Art Gallery in Ontario. You have to go see her. She's incredible.
Omar has one word to me.
I'm sorry, we've been kind of silent for a while. One word. It's simple. It's like.
Bertolt Brecht said, I went to a medical school and I learned how to play the guitar. And he is one of the most important dramatists of the 20th century. So it's up to us cultural producers. All right?
On that note, nobody else has any single word. You're wrapping this up. Ben, do you want to say any closing remarks?
Definitely. So thanks everyone for coming to a dark room on a Sunday afternoon at the beginning of spring. We will be doing this again next year. And,
Oh, yes! Oh, yes, it's
in 1 second. We will be doing one again next year. We will try and follow up on this with some other contentious conversations. Over the next while, the community in Toronto will be starting a new magazine/journal, Media, Art and Politics, that will be addressing many of these questions over the next few years. So hopefully we can involve everyone in that process. Remember, tonight, Lucy Raven at 5 at Jackman Hall. Then Images continues with 2 other programs, both at Jackman Hall. Then tomorrow, 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock talk. 3 o'clock talk and more screenings for another 7 days. So we hope to see everybody at all of those. After party at Cinecycle. After parties at Cinecycle. Thank you to Alice Cine, Images, and Media Arts Network of Ontario. Monarch.
Because I have a microphone, I'm kind of like this, I want to know what the vote is, right?
Yes.
Okay?
Deanna organizes the vote.
Yes, art school is killing art. Show of hands, please. Less than we started.
Attrition.
Okay. No, art school is not killing art.
How many changed their mind?
Who changed their mind?
Listening.
I
went from undecided to yes to art school.
Yes to art school.
No art school. Yes to good art school.
Okay. Thank you.